Since I can remember, questioning the why of everything has become my greatest occupation. Waking up was a burden, a weight I carried every day. The sun would rise, but inside me, there was always darkness, a dense cloud that enveloped me, suffocating any spark of hope. I would open my eyes, look at the ceiling of my room, and the first thought that would arise was always the same. Why does nothing work out for me? My life seemed to follow a repetitive pattern of failures. The same routines, the same frustrations. The alarm clock would ring, pulling me from a sleep that, to be honest, was never truly restorative. I would get up, drag myself to the bathroom, and confront my reflection in the mirror. A tired face, empty eyes, an expression that reflected all the discouragement I felt. And there, between brushing my teeth and washing my face, the questions would arise again. Why isn't my life like other people's? Why can't I find joy? It was a fatigue that had no physical explanation, but it weighed on every movement. At work, my colleagues seemed to fit in so well, like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't assemble. I always had the feeling of being out of place, of being a lost piece in a world that seemed to run at a different frequency than mine. I would look around and see faces that, at least on the surface, seemed satisfied, happy. And me? I could barely hold a conversation without feeling even more defeated inside. The comparisons were inevitable. So-and-so just got promoted, I thought, with a knot in my throat. So-and-so is always traveling, living their dreams. And what about me? I was stagnant, stuck in a job I hated, in a routine that seemed to drain the little vital energy I still had left. Sometimes I wondered if things would ever change. And more than that, if I truly deserved any change. My personal relationships weren't helping either. It felt as if the universe had assigned me the role of an extra in everyone else's lives, always on the sidelines, observing but never truly participating. At home, the silences between my partner and me grew longer and more uncomfortable. It seemed that, by complaining so much and playing the victim, I had built invisible walls around myself. The people around me began to distance themselves, perhaps tired of hearing the same laments over and over. I was an unpleasant company. I knew that, but I didn't know how to change. Little by little, I began to believe that life took a perverse pleasure in watching me fail. As if each small obstacle, every argument, every setback was proof that I was destined for failure. The world moved on while I sank deeper into this pit of self-pity. And the worst part was that, even knowing how harmful this was to me, I couldn't stop. The question, why me, echoed in my mind like an inevitable sentence. I was the eternal victim of a purposeless life, of a cruel destiny. No matter what I did, everything seemed to crumble. Plans failed, personal projects stagnated, and any attempt at improvement was quickly swallowed by new problems. With each new defeat, I sank even further. My thoughts were constantly dark. If life is a gift, where is mine? I wondered, with growing bitterness. And so, another day began, with the same weight on my shoulders and the same bitter taste in my mouth. I knew something was wrong, but what? And more importantly, how could I fix something that seemed broken from the start? I always had the feeling that no one understood me. It was as if I were shouting in an empty place where my words echoed, but no one really listened. The few attempts I made to vent to friends or family always ended the same way. Empty advice, canned phrases, as if my suffering were merely a temporary inconvenience to them. And that made me feel even more isolated, more alone. At work, the situation was no different. I felt invisible. No matter how hard I tried, if I could even truly try anymore, I never received recognition. I watched as colleagues were promoted, praised for their achievements, while I remained stagnant, trapped in a repetitive routine, with no prospects for growth. It must be luck, I thought, a way to internally justify the success of others, as if it were impossible for merit or hard work to actually lead someone to success. This frustration spilled over into my personal life. Conversations with my partner became increasingly rare and monotonous. The silence between us stretched out like a comfortable void, a place where it was easier to say nothing than to confront the problems surrounding us. She had become distant, perhaps tired of dealing with my constant complaints and my perpetual state of self-pity. I didn't blame her. I was tired of myself. I remember one specific night. We were having dinner together in silence when she finally broke the ice. "Aren't you tired of always being the victim, blaming the world for everything?" Her words cut me, but instead of reflecting, I felt a wave of anger and self-defense. How could she say that? Didn't she see how much I was suffering? Didn't she realize I was the unluckiest person in the world, that everything always went wrong for me? I felt an urgent need to justify myself, to once again play the role of the misunderstood victim. "You don't understand," was all I could manage to say. And the conversation ended there. The truth was that maybe no one really understood me. No one knew the weight of waking up every day with the feeling of failure, of carrying an invisible burden, of living trapped in a cycle where things always seem to go wrong. And the most frustrating thing of all was that I constantly asked myself, why me? What had I done to deserve a life like this? Sometimes, I caught myself looking at the people around me, trying to understand how they managed to move on so easily. It was as if everyone had found the secret to happiness, except for me. Friendships, relationships, work, everything flowed for them, while I was stuck in an emotional quagmire, struggling to stay afloat. It was tiring, exhausting. And the worst part was the feeling that no one really seemed to care. I began to isolate myself more and more. Stopping my attempts was easier than continuing to fail. At least this way, I avoided new disappointments. Meeting up with friends became sporadic, and even when it happened, I could no longer be the same person as before. My thoughts were always focused on my own problems. I watched conversations pass by as a distant spectator, unable to fully participate. They talked about trips, achievements, dreams, all those things that seemed so far away from me. Deep down, I knew I was pushing people away, but I also knew I didn't have the strength to do otherwise. My relationship was on the brink of collapse. The lonely nights on the couch became more frequent, and the feeling of failure as a partner only added to the weight I already carried. The worst part was that, in a way, I believed all of this was inevitable. That life, in some cruel way, had decided that I didn't deserve to be happy. And so I continued, wrapped up in my own world of complaints, disappointments, and frustrations. Day after day, I sank deeper into the role of the victim. I watched the world pass around me like a distant film, wondering, why does it seem so easy for others, but so hard for me? The weight of being misunderstood grew with each passing day. I was distancing myself from everyone, but deep down, that wasn't what I wanted. What I desired most was for someone to understand my pain, for someone to reach out and tell me that everything would be okay. But that hand never came, and the feeling of loneliness only increased. Each day, I sank further into the spiral of self-pity. It was as if I were trapped in an invisible chain pulling me down, and the more I struggled, the stronger that chain became. Everything seemed to go wrong, and I was convinced that the world had some kind of conspiracy against me. It was no longer a matter of coincidences or bad luck. I truly believed that the universe had decided my life would be filled with constant failures. If I forgot to pay a bill, the thought immediately came to me, of course, another one for the list of everything I mess up. If an argument started at home, I thought, it's obvious that no one wants to listen to me. I'm a burden. At work, the slightest mistake made me question my worth, my abilities, my existence. It was as if I were constantly sabotaging myself, searching for reasons to justify the victim role I had already embraced. Little by little, I began to avoid any situation that could challenge me or jeopardize the little emotional stability I still had. It was easier to avoid new failures than to face the possibility that I might actually achieve something. The fear of failing was so great that I preferred not to try at all. My mind had become a battlefield, where the only weapons were my own complaints, and I always lost. I remember a specific episode when I decided to apply for a position in a project at work. At first, I felt excited, as if maybe this could be an opportunity to turn things around. But as soon as I started working on the idea, negative thoughts came crashing in like an avalanche. "You won't succeed," my mind whispered. "Why try if you always fail in the end?" And, as with so many other times, I gave up before even submitting the proposal. It was always like this. I prepared for something, but before taking any step, the conviction that I would fail made me back down. The small daily failures, which for many could be insignificant, took on gigantic proportions within me. If I dropped something on the floor, if I forgot to reply to a message, everything became yet another proof that I wasn't good enough. Each mistake reinforced my belief that I was destined for failure, and so the cycle repeated. The more I lamented, the more things seemed to go wrong. It was as if life had turned into a cruel game, and I was the main character in an endless tragedy. I looked to the past and could only see the mistakes, the moments when things didn't go right. My crumbling relationships, the opportunities that never materialized, the dreams that never left the paper. "Why me?" was the constant question, a repeated mantra echoing infinitely in my mind. And the answer never came. I isolated myself more and more. At work, conversations with colleagues were brief and mechanical. I couldn't connect with anyone, and in fact, I didn't even want to. My self-pity had become an armor, a protection against the possibility of more disappointments. If I didn't engage, if I didn't try, then no one could hurt me, no one could frustrate me. But at the same time, I felt an overwhelming loneliness. It was like being trapped in a room with invisible walls, where I could see people living their lives, but never truly participating. I saw my friends' social media posts and thought, look, they have everything. And what do I have? Just problems. I began to avoid meetings, gatherings, and any situation where I had to pretend to be okay. The truth was, I didn't know how to be okay anymore. The worst part was that, on some deep level, I knew my life didn't have to be like this. There was a small voice, drowned out by the shouts of self-pity, telling me that I had a choice, that I could try to change. But that voice was so weak, so distant, that I ignored it. It was easier to believe that the blame lay with fate, with circumstances, with anything external that didn't depend on me. And so, I continued to live on autopilot, watching my own life pass by like an apathetic spectator. I was a prisoner of my own mind, trapped in a cycle of negativity that seemed endless. Complaining was all I knew how to do, and even though I knew it was slowly destroying me, I couldn't stop. There were days when I simply couldn't get out of bed. The weight of life was unbearable, and the thought of facing another day of frustrations paralyzed me. In those moments, I surrendered to silence, to the darkness of my room, as if hiding from the world could somehow lessen the pain. But the problem was that, no matter how much I tried to escape, the storm always found me. My thoughts were always there, hammering my mind with the same cycle of complaints and disillusionments. It was on one of those mornings, when everything seemed darker than usual, that something unexpected happened. I was lying there, staring at the ceiling, when my phone began to vibrate. It was a birthday notification, someone I hardly spoke to anymore, an old schoolmate. In an almost automatic gesture, I clicked on the notification and was directed to his profile. There he was, smiling, surrounded by friends and family, traveling, celebrating achievements. The contrast between his life and mine felt brutal. While he was having fun, living fully, I was here, trapped, ruminating over my failures. I felt a tightness in my chest, a mix of envy and frustration. Why is life so easy for him? I thought. It was unfair. But as I scrolled through the photos, sinking deeper into my own misery, something curious happened. I came across a photo of him in a hospital. He looked thinner, bald, and the smile on his face seemed fragile, yet it was still there. The caption of the photo spoke about a battle against a serious illness, something I hadn't even known he had gone through. Fighting, but grateful for each day, the message said. That caught me by surprise. I couldn't take my eyes off those words. Grateful for each day? He had faced something so terrible and still managed to be grateful? The contrast with my own life hit me hard. Here I was, complaining about everything, playing the victim, while he had faced a truly difficult situation and still found reasons to be thankful. That photo and that caption stayed etched in my mind for the rest of the day. I couldn't ignore them. They bothered me, disturbed me. How could he have that perspective? It didn't make sense to me. If I were in his shoes, I would have certainly given up, sunk even deeper into self-pity. And yet, he seemed determined to live, to find meaning even amid the chaos. That night was one of the most restless I've ever had. I couldn't sleep. My thoughts kept returning to that photo, to that smile. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't just lamenting. Something inside me was starting to stir, something I didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. It was as if, suddenly, my perspective on the world was being challenged. Everything I had always believed about how unfair life was to me was beginning to seem small. But even in the face of this discomfort, my resistance to change was enormous. Maybe he was just lucky, I told myself, trying to rationalize. Maybe his situation wasn't as severe. My brain tried to find any justification to avoid confronting the truth head-on. I still wanted to believe that life was harsher on me than on anyone else. After all, admitting that I might be wrong, that my perspective was distorted, was frightening. However, the seed of doubt had been planted. The cycle of victimization that once seemed so solid and unshakable began, even if timidly, to show cracks. I started to question whether perhaps, just perhaps, the way I was seeing life was, in fact, what was imprisoning me. I wanted to resist that idea. Comfortable in the role of victim, changing meant facing a reality I wasn't sure I was ready to accept. But the image of that fragile smile, yet filled with gratitude, continued to haunt me. What did that mean? Why was this affecting me so much? I didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was certain. Something inside me was beginning to transform, even against my will. The next morning, I woke up with a lump in my throat, as if something was about to happen, although nothing special was planned. The discomfort from the previous night still reverberated in my mind. The words of that old classmate, the image of him in the hospital, still pursued me despite all my efforts to move on. With each thought, I felt a heavier weight, a strange restlessness growing inside me. At work, the same mechanical tasks unfolded, but my mind was elsewhere. The photo and the caption hammered away at my thoughts, impossible to forget. My colleagues talked about weekend plans, trips, parties, and everything seemed superficial in the face of the reality of that man, who had faced something so terrible and still managed to smile. I wondered how he did that, and the question consumed me. My own self-pity no longer felt as comfortable as it once did. Something was changing, and I didn't know how to deal with it. But then, as if the universe had decided to intensify the blow, I received a message in the middle of the afternoon. It was from a number I didn't recognize, but the message simply said, "We need to talk. It's urgent." My heart raced. Was it something serious? What could it be? My stomach churned, and my thoughts began to race in circles. Could it be more bad news? The truth was, deep down, I expected it to be something bad. It was what I was used to, always expecting the worst. And, as always, I was ready to play the victim role even before knowing what it was. I sent a reply asking who it was, and soon came the answer. An old friend, someone I had lost contact with. That surprised me. "Can you talk to me now?" Read the next message. I didn't think much. I just called. On the other end of the line, his voice sounded nervous, but the tone was that of someone who needed to vent. He had just discovered he was sick, something serious. And what struck me the most was the despair in his voice. He, who always seemed so strong, so self-assured, was completely falling apart. It was like hearing a mirrored version of myself, someone who was also drowning in fear and uncertainty, only this time. His situation was tangible, real, something much bigger than my routine problems. "I don't know what to do," he repeated several times, as if he were lost, as if he were on the edge of an abyss. When I hung up the phone, I felt crushed. My world, once centered on my own complaints, now seemed small and insignificant. The illness, the fear, the despair, all of it was very real, and suddenly I was confronted with the fact that perhaps my worldview, my constant victim role, was a choice. A convenient choice to avoid dealing with what truly mattered. And for the first time in a long time, I asked myself, is life really as bad as I make it seem? This question echoed in my mind for the rest of the day. Something inside me was cracking, and I didn't know whether it was good or bad. I just felt the impact. I could no longer pretend that my problems were as big as I made them seem. What had once been a comfort, complaining, playing the victim, now felt empty, purposeless. Confronting reality was shaking me, and I didn't know how to deal with it. By the end of the night, as I tried to rest, I realized I could no longer go back. Something had been awakened within me, and the feeling was uncomfortable, yet impossible to ignore. I knew that, in some way, my life was about to change. The question was I ready to face whatever came next? The following days passed like a blur. I was still processing the phone call, my friend's illness, and that constant feeling that something bigger was on the horizon. It was as if my world was in transition, yet I still couldn't understand what that meant. All I knew was that I could no longer continue living the same way. At work, my mind wandered. The same mechanical tasks, the same colleagues talking about their seemingly perfect lives. But now something was different. I could no longer dive into my complaints as I had before. It was as if, suddenly, complaining lost its meaning. My self-pity, which once felt so comfortable, now felt like a burden. And this realization frightened me. I remembered when, as a child, I was first told that life was a gift from God. Back then, those words seemed abstract, a vague concept I didn't understand. But now, an idea was beginning to form in my mind, an uncomfortable yet liberating idea. Perhaps, just perhaps, I was wasting that gift. I questioned myself. Were my problems really that significant? By focusing so much on my flaws and what was wrong, was I ignoring everything that was still good? I didn't know the answers, but these questions began to arise more frequently. And with each new doubt, I felt as though I was distancing myself from the victim role and moving closer to something bigger, something I still couldn't define. During a break at work, I decided to send a message to that old colleague, the one from the hospital photos. A part of me hesitated. What could I possibly say to him? But another part, the one that was transforming, pushed me to act. When the message was sent, I felt strangely light. It was as if, in that small gesture, I was beginning to accept that life wasn't just about me and my problems. And to my surprise, he responded almost immediately. "I'm glad you reached out," he said. "Sometimes, all we need is to remember that we're not alone." Those words, they were simple but powerful. I had always felt alone, isolated in my problems, but for the first time, I began to understand that perhaps isolation was, in part, my choice. And maybe, by extending a hand, even timidly, I could start to break down that barrier. It was at that moment that I realized I was no longer in the same place I had been before. Something inside me had changed, and I was beginning to awaken to a new reality. A reality where life, despite all its challenges, was still a gift. A gift that, until then, I had ignored. I hoped that after that exchange of messages, something magical would happen. Perhaps a sense of fulfillment, a renewed feeling of purpose. But to my surprise, the emptiness was still there, silent, watching me with every step I took. The transformation I felt approaching was still uncomfortable, as if it were waiting for the right moment to manifest fully. In the following days, everything seemed slower, as if time had slowed down just to force me to reflect. My old complaints continued to arise, but something about them was different. I was beginning to see a new layer of reality that had previously been invisible. Every little inconvenience, every frustration, now felt insignificant. It was as if my daily problems, those that I had so amplified, were shrinking before something bigger that I still couldn't grasp. It was on one of those monotonous afternoons that, when leaving work, I decided to do something different. Instead of heading straight home and burying myself on the couch as usual, I took an alternate route, a path I hadn't traveled in years. There was a park at the end of that street, a place I used to go when I needed a little peace. The park hadn't changed much since the last time I was there, but something inside me felt different as I walked through it. There were children running, couples walking hand in hand, and elderly people sitting on benches, watching life pass by with calm smiles on their faces. For the first time in a long time, I asked myself, did these people have their own problems too? Even in the face of difficulties, did they find moments of peace, of gratitude? That idea began to root itself in my mind in a way I hadn't expected. If these people could, why couldn't I? My mind, accustomed to filling itself with negative questions, was now beginning to open up to new possibilities. I didn't have all the answers, but I felt I was on the right path, as if I were about to discover something profound, something that would forever change the way I saw life. With every step through the park, my mind wandered through recent conversations. I thought of my sick friend, of my colleague who had faced an even greater battle, and I realized that, in some way, they shared one thing in common: gratitude. A genuine gratitude for life, even in its most difficult moments. This intrigued me and, at the same time, provoked me. How could I, after years of complaining and playing the victim, begin to see life from that perspective? I sat on a bench, observing the movement around me, trying to absorb that new reality. And then, as if the universe were testing me, I received an unexpected call. It was from my mother. She always called me, but that day, the call seemed to come at a crucial moment. "Son," she said, with a caring but firm voice, "have you ever stopped to think about all the good things that have happened in your life? Even the small ones?" The question caught me off guard. In recent times, I had only been able to see what was wrong. But she continued, without waiting for a response. "I know you're going through a tough time, but life is made up of these small things, these blessings that we sometimes overlook." Those words echoed within me. I had ignored the small things for so long. But perhaps, just perhaps, they were the key to understanding something much greater. The call ended shortly after, but I sat there, absorbing every word she had said, as if my mind were finally ready to receive them. As the sun began to set, something changed within me. The feeling of emptiness began to give way to a new realization. I didn't need grand changes or extraordinary events to start appreciating life. Perhaps the secret lay in the small things, those I had always overlooked by focusing so much on what didn't work. And in that moment, for the first time, I began to feel something that seemed like gratitude. The next day, I woke up with a different feeling. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A lightness I hadn't felt in a long time. Instead of dragging myself through the morning as usual, I allowed myself a moment to take a deep breath and observe what was around me. Breakfast, the soft light of the sun streaming through the window, the calm silence of the house. They were simple things, but they now seemed to carry a new meaning. On my way to work, I paid more attention to the details. The trees swaying in the wind, the hurried people, the random conversations I used to ignore. Everything that had once seemed insignificant now felt like it was telling a story. Maybe I was starting to understand what my mother meant by the little things. At the office, the same old complaints arose. Tight deadlines, demanding bosses, irritating colleagues. But somehow, it didn't affect me as it used to. Sure, there were still moments of frustration, but the difference lay in how I faced them. Instead of sinking into self-pity, I began to ask myself, were these problems really that big? Or was I making everything harder because of my perspective? It was an ordinary day, but something within me was transforming. My thoughts drifted back, time and again, to that conversation with my mother, to my walk in the park, and to the idea that life is made up of small moments. I, who had always waited for big plot twists, was now starting to recognize the value of what surrounded me, even if they were tiny details. The feeling of gratitude was still new to me, almost strange, but it was there, growing slowly like a plant that finally finds fertile soil to develop. It was a subtle but powerful change, and I had no idea how far it would take me. But at that moment, for the first time in years, I began to believe that life, with all its ups and downs, was truly a gift that I had, until then, neglected. The following weeks were a constant balancing act between old habits and new perceptions. My mind still clung to that tendency to complain and play the victim, but something had shifted. I was beginning to recognize these patterns within myself, as if I were observing my life from the outside. It felt strange, almost uncomfortable, but at the same time, liberating. That feeling of gratitude, which had once seemed like an unattainable fantasy, began to appear unexpectedly. In a simple coffee with a coworker, in the smile of a child on the street, or even on a rainy afternoon, something within me opened up to see beyond the difficulties. I couldn't deny it. Despite the problems, life went on, and to my surprise, it still offered me moments of beauty. It was on one of those nights, while I reflected on all these changes, that something unexpected happened. I received a message from my sister, someone I rarely spoke to. "We need to talk. Something important has happened," the text said. My heart raced, a mix of curiosity and concern. What could be so urgent? I called her immediately, and what she told me caught me off guard. She was pregnant. I should have been happy for her, and in a way, I was. But my first impulse was to think about how this would affect my life. This is going to change everything, I thought, without really understanding what I was saying. "I know we haven't been that close lately," she began, her voice sounding hesitant on the other end of the line. "But I wanted you to be around this time. I want my child to know their uncle." Those words disarmed me. Suddenly, I realized that life was giving me another opportunity to reconnect with what really mattered. And for the first time in a long time, I felt genuinely moved. A new life was about to arrive, and I had the chance to be a part of it. As I hung up the phone, I realized that, even without noticing, I was starting to make space for new experiences. My world, once so closed and limited to my own problems, was beginning to expand. And this expansion was both frightening and liberating. That night, I lay down feeling a lightness I hadn't experienced in a long time. And for the first time in a very, very long time, I smiled. Not a forced smile or one meant to hide what I really felt, but a genuine smile, coming from a deep place within me. Life, at last, was beginning to make sense. I woke up that morning with a different feeling, as if something was about to change permanently. Time seemed to slow down, as if the universe was holding its breath, waiting for something important. As I opened my eyes, I felt a calmness wash over me. It wasn't a calmness that came from the certainty that everything would be okay, but rather an acceptance that, regardless of the challenges, I was exactly where I needed to be. As I walked through the house, I noticed the small details around me. The distant sound of birds, the familiar smell of freshly brewed coffee, the soft light filtering through the curtains. Everything felt different. But what had truly changed wasn't the world around me. It was the way I saw it. Suddenly, I was overwhelmed by a childhood memory of when my grandmother used to say to me, "Life is a gift from God, but it's up to us to unwrap it carefully." Those words, which had never really made sense to me before, now fit together like pieces of a puzzle. I realized, with an almost startling clarity, that life, with all its difficulties, was still a gift. And more than that, it was a gift that I had neglected for far too long. What happened next was almost a silent miracle. Without any conscious effort, I began to feel grateful. It wasn't forced gratitude, the kind we try to cultivate in moments of despair, but authentic gratitude that naturally sprang from within me. I was thankful for the air I breathed, for the people in my life, for the simple fact of being alive. And for the first time, I understood the true meaning of being present. There were still challenges, of course. Life hadn't magically become perfect, but now I knew I was equipped to handle whatever came my way without needing to hide behind self-pity or victimhood. I was no longer a victim of my circumstances. I was an active participant in my own story. That afternoon, I went out for a walk, and everything around me seemed to pulsate with life. The colors were more vibrant, the sound sharper, and even the cold wind on my face felt like a blessing. With every step I took, I was reminded that, despite all the ups and downs, life was a gift I no longer wanted to waste. And so, in that moment of stillness, I finally understood. Life, with all its imperfections, was a gift from God. A gift I was now ready to honor by living each day with more awareness, gratitude, and love. A few weeks passed since the day I finally embraced the idea that life was, indeed, a gift from God. I can't say everything had changed overnight. There were still challenges, still moments when my old self, the victimized, complaining version, tried to emerge from the shadows. But now, something within me was different. I had learned to listen to a new voice, a softer one that reminded me to be thankful, to see the good, to recognize the blessings, even in the small things. But then, life, as it likes to do, threw me one last test, a test I could never have predicted. It was a quiet afternoon when I received an unexpected call. It was my father. He and I didn't have the closest relationship. For much of my life, I had seen him as a distant figure, someone who always seemed disappointed in me, someone who never understood my dreams or my insecurities. In a way, he was the symbol of everything I considered wrong in my life. "We need to talk," he said bluntly, his voice serious, almost cold. My heart raced. Old memories surged back, memories of arguments, of bitter words exchanged in the heat of the moment. I knew there was a lot unresolved between us, and as much as I had transformed, I realized a part of me still carried the weight of that broken relationship. I arrived at his house in the late afternoon. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. That tranquil scene stood in stark contrast to the turmoil within me. When I entered, I saw my father sitting at the kitchen table, his face marked by time, but with something different in his gaze. He seemed vulnerable. He began to speak before I could even sit down. "You know, I've made many mistakes," he said, looking down as if afraid to meet my eyes. "Mistakes with you, with your mother, with our family. I've always been hard on you, always expected you to be what I wanted to be but never could." Those words hit me like a punch. I had never, in all these years, imagined he would admit something like that. I had always thought my father was unbreakable, trapped in his rigid opinions, incapable of recognizing his flaws. But there, in that moment, I saw a broken man, a man who, just like me, was struggling to understand the value of life. And then he looked at me, his eyes shining with something I hadn't seen since I was a child. "I want to ask for your forgiveness," he said, his voice trembling. "For everything. For not being the father you deserved, for judging you and expecting so much. I know this doesn't erase what happened, but I wanted you to know." I felt a lump in my throat. All the hurts, all the disappointments I had carried for so long were right there in front of me. And for the first time, I realized I had my share of guilt too. For years, I had played the victim, blaming my father for everything that went wrong in my life, without ever trying to understand his side, without realizing he was also a man filled with flaws, fears, and regrets. In that moment, something broke within me, something heavy, something that had kept me from moving forward. "I forgive you," I heard my voice say, almost without thinking. And in that instant, I realized I was freeing myself, not just from him, but from all the pain I had accumulated over the years. He cried, and so did I. Two men, finally stripped of their defenses, connected by pain and the desire to heal. That was the last encounter with my past. A past filled with resentments that had held me in the same place until that moment. In the days that followed, something curious happened. I felt light. It was as if a huge shadow that I hadn't even realized was following me had finally disappeared. The forgiveness I extended to my father wasn't just for him. It was for me. And I understood, once and for all, that life was so much more than the wounds of the past. It was about choices. And in that moment, I chose to live fully. The change was subtle yet constant. Each day, I woke up with a new determination, a new perspective. The complaints that used to be part of my routine now seemed absurd, almost childish. There was a new space within me, a space reserved for what truly mattered: gratitude, love, and the desire to make the most of the time I had left. My relationship with my sister strengthened, and I began to draw closer to my family. I was no longer that isolated man, lost in his own problems. I now understood that we weren't alone on this journey. Love was what connected us and gave us the strength to move forward. At work, things also began to change. The situations that once stressed me out were now opportunities for growth. I was no longer afraid of failure because I knew that, no matter what happened, I would be able to handle the consequences. Life had taught me the most important lesson. What truly matters isn't the outcomes, but how we choose to face the journey. And so, little by little, my life began to transform. Not through magic, but because I had finally understood that the key to happiness wasn't in external circumstances, but within me. And that key was love. The love for myself, for others, and for the life that had been given to me as a gift.